Welcome to the second half of the unit on genetics. We're going to now shift to looking a bit less at the actual biochemistry of genetics and what DNA is and that sort of thing, to actually how genetic inheritance works and how traits are passed on. So for this lesson, we're specifically going to be looking at what inheritance is, what we mean by it, the terms we use, what a trait is, how traits get inherited, and we're also going to start learning about how to calculate the probability of certain traits being passed on. So let's start with the basics. What is genetic inheritance? Well, we can summarize it this way. Genetic inheritance is the passing on of characteristics from one generation to the next generation. Now, we don't tend to just call them inherited characteristics. We talk about them as traits. So we can talk about genetic traits, or you can just call them traits. Now, the traits that get passed on here, and the traits that we see in people, are going to be influenced by people's genes and the genetics they actually have. But they're also influenced by the environment. As the person or the organism, maybe we're not talking about people, is developing, we also see the environment can have an impact. You might have genes that would mean that your height trait would be really, really tall, but if you don't have good nutrition early on, and that's an environmental factor, then you're going to find that you might not actually express your height trait as your genes intended, because the environment's having an impact there on your development. So the environment can also play a bit of a role there in what happens. So we're going to watch a video now, just going over the basics of inheritance.
When living things reproduce, they pass DNA to their offspring. Through asexual reproduction, some living things can reproduce without a partner. Offspring made this way are genetically identical to the parent. Other living things, like people, reproduce with a partner. This is called sexual reproduction. Offspring made this way inherit equal amounts of DNA from two parents. Each of us has 2 copies of every gene. The 2 copies may be the same, or they may be different. The combined output from all of our genes influences our inherited traits. When a couple has children, each parent passes down 1 copy of each of their genes. For each gene, which copy is passed along is random, and it may be different for each child. Each child gets a unique combination of copies of all of their parents' genes. This mixing contributes to genetic variation. Because they share genes, children resemble their parents and each other. But unique gene combinations give each individual a unique set of inherited characteristics. Looking farther back in the family tree, the parents' DNA came from their parents, so the children also share DNA with their grandparents. But the amount they share with each grandparent is only half as much as they share with each parent. Looking back to the great-grandparents, the children share DNA with all of them, but only half again as much. This inheritance pattern explains why you have more genes in common with closer relatives, like your mom, than you do with more distant relatives, like your great-grandmother. In this way, your DNA holds a record of your family relationships.
So let's rewind the clock a little bit and actually go back to where this all began. So if we're going to look at the very beginning of what we think of as genetics, we need to start looking at a bloke by the name of Gregor Mendel, or Mendel. Now, Mendel was born in 1822 in Austria. He was born to a farming family, and he grew up working on the family farm. So he was pretty cluey about how you would grow plants and that sort of thing, and how you might try and breed certain plants or certain animals together to get the best types of traits for their offspring. Now, he was a pretty cluey guy, and I believe he wanted a bit of an education, but his family were farmers, and so it's not really going to lend themselves for him getting a good education. But one way in that time period that you could be well educated is if you went and became a monk, because being a monk in a monastery, you would be educated and you would learn about stuff there just as part of your duties of being a monk. So he went and he became a monk in a monastery. And so while he was there in the monastery, he was able to conduct research into the way pea plants were actually inheriting traits. Why pea plants? Not really sure, but they actually ended up being really useful. And I think he did also look at some other plants or animals, but pea plants were sort of the main one we know his work from. So what he ended up doing is he bred pea plants together and looked at how the parent pea plants passed on their traits to their offspring and what got passed on when and in what way. And all this work he did actually earned him the title of the father of genetics. In fact, we talk often about genetics being like Mendelian genetics, actually named after him because of the work he did was so important to our understanding of modern day genetics. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, how did he breed pea plants? I understand how you could breed animals together, but how on earth do you breed plants together? Well, you've got to remember that plants can also be what we would call sexually reproducing, so they're going to have gametes. They will have cells that are their sperm cells and cells that are their egg cells, and it's just a matter of getting those two to combine and have the sperm cell fertilize the egg cell. Plants just do it differently, and so sometimes they rely on things like wind or bees to pollinate, that sort of thing. They will rely on something else to move that pollen to where the egg is, because the pollen is the sperm. So what Mendel would have done is he would have grown pea plants and he would have recorded all these different things about the traits that they had. So maybe flower colour or seed pod colour, pea colour, where the leaves were, the shape of the leaves, all these sorts of different things he would have recorded. And he would have had two parent plants, and he would have taken from the pollen from one of them and used it to fertilize the flowers where the eggs were on the other plant. And then that would have produced seed pods or pea pods, and you can then take them and you can plant those peas in the ground and they will give rise to new pea plants. They're the offspring of the first two. And so from that, you've got this offspring pea plant. You can now start to look at all its traits. What colour flowers does it have? What colour seed pods or peas does it have? And from doing that, that would have meant that Mendel could have started to go, oh, okay, so the parents had these two different coloured flowers, but the offspring were only ever producing this colour. And you know, things like that. Might have not been any blending of traits, because that was sort of the prevailing thinking at the time, that offspring were just a mix of their parents and you'd basically be halfway between. So if you're a dark coloured parent and a light coloured parent, then you would end up with somebody who colouring in the middle. And that was just the thinking on all traits. But what Mendel did is he started to see that wasn't necessarily the case, that sometimes traits were passed on and other times they weren't. Sometimes they seemed to skip a generation and all that sort of thing. So that was how Mendel was actually able to look at traits in pea plants. So we're actually going to watch a video now going over Mendel and his investigations with pea plants.
These days, scientists know how you inherit characteristics from your parents. They're able to calculate probabilities of having a specific trait or getting a genetic disease according to the information they have from the parents and the family history. But how is this possible? To understand how traits pass from one living being to its descendants, we need to go back in time to the 19th century and a man named Gregor Mendel. Mendel was an Austrian monk and biologist who loved to work with plants. By breeding the pea plants he was growing in the monastery's garden, he discovered the principles that rule heredity. In one of the most classic examples, Mendel combined a purebred yellow-seeded plant with a purebred green-seeded plant, and he got only yellow seeds. He called the yellow color trait the dominant one, because it was expressed in all the new seeds. Then he let the new yellow-seeded hybrid plants self-fertilize, and in this second generation he got both yellow and green seeds, which meant that the green trait had been hidden by the dominant yellow. He called this hidden trait the recessive trait. From those results, Mendel inferred that each trait depends on a pair of factors, one of them coming from the mother and the other from the father. Now we know that these factors are called alleles and represent the different variations of a gene. Depending on which type of allele Mendel found in each seed, we can have what we call a homozygous pea, where both alleles are identical, and what we call a heterozygous pea, when the two alleles are different. This combination of alleles is known as genotype, and its result, being yellow or green, is called phenotype. To clearly visualize how alleles are distributed amongst descendants, we can use a diagram called the Punnett square. You just place the different alleles on both axes, and then you figure out the possible combinations. Let's look at Mendel's peas, for example. Let's write the dominant yellow allele as an uppercase y, and the recessive green allele as a lowercase y. The uppercase y always overpowers his lowercase friend, so the only time you get green babies is if you have two lowercase y's. In Mendel's first generation, the yellow homozygous pea mom will give each pea kid a yellow dominant allele, and the green homozygous pea dad will give a green recessive allele, so all the pea kids will be yellow heterozygous. Then, in the second generation, where the two heterozygous kids marry, their babies could have any of the three possible genotypes, showing the two possible phenotypes in a 3-to-1 proportion. But even peas have a lot of characteristics. For example, besides being yellow or green, peas may be round or wrinkled. So we could have all these possible combinations: round yellow peas, round green peas, wrinkled yellow peas, and wrinkled green peas. To calculate the proportions for each genotype and phenotype, we can use a Punnett square too. Of course, this will make it a little more complex. And lots of things are more complicated than peas, like, say, people. These days, scientists know a lot more about genetics and heredity, and there are many other ways in which some characteristics are inherited, but it all started with Mendel and his peas.
So we're going to pause there, and that's going to be the end of part 1 of the videos for this module, and you've got some work to do, or some activities to help go and reinforce the work we've just covered, and I will see you in part 2.